In this module, we will look at principles of medical documentation and report writing. Once completed with this module, you should be able to identify the minimum data to be included on a patient care report, identify the general principles regarding the importance of EMS documentation and the ways in which such documentation is used, describe the potential consequences of illegible, incomplete, or inaccurate documentation, describe the special documentation considerations concerning patient refusal of care or transport, and describe the special considerations concerning mass casualty incidents or other unique reports. In examining the need for medical documentation and proper report writing within EMS, it is helpful to recognize that EMS documentation serves two primary purposes. The first relates to the fact that EMS providers are delivering medical care to patients. Thus, EMS documentation is part of the patient's medical record, which requires the collection of specific data, such as patient demographics, medical history, assessment findings, medical device data, treatments provided, medications delivered, procedures performed, and the patient's final disposition upon delivery at the hospital. The second purpose is more legal and administrative in nature. EMS documentation is vital for billing and quality improvement initiatives. In the event of a lawsuit, the patient care report is also critical. Such data elements include dispatch and incident information, billing and insurance information, specific data for various registries, such as those related to trauma, stroke, or cardiac arrest systems, quality management indicators, including outcome data, domestic terrorism data, and linkage data so various databases can talk to each other and share data. When looking at EMS reporting and mandatory data elements that must be collected, we must recognize the impact of Nemesis, the National EMS Information System, on the process. Since the passage of the EMS Systems Act in 1973, data collection and documentation has always been a recognized component, duty, or responsibility, depending on how you look at it, of EMS. While individual agencies have historically maintained their own data, having that data isolated without the ability to aggregate it across systems, regions, states, or even nationally was a problem. In 2001, Nemesis and the National EMS Database were developed as part of a collaborative effort between the National Association of State EMS Directors, NHTSA, and the Trauma and EMS Systems Program at the Health Resources and Services Administration's Maternal and Child Health Bureau. Within 7 years, all states, the District of Columbia, and the 5 U.S. incorporated territories signed a Memorandum of Understanding that established the need for standardized EMS data element definitions, standardized data collection at the state level, and a defined set of Nemesis data elements. As stated directly on the Nemesis.org website, the primary goal of the Nemesis project is to improve the understanding of, confidence in, and support for EMS data collection and analysis across all target audiences within the EMS community so that the data may be utilized more effectively to improve patient care. As of October 2018, the Nemesis dataset was in version 3.4.0. There were 130 required PCR elements defined within this version of the Nemesis dataset, although states may require the reporting of additional elements within their own systems as the full dataset contains 428 separate PCR data elements. This is in addition to the 157 total data elements for agency demographics, of which 35 are required. As you can see on the map, most states and territories were reporting at least version 2 data, with almost as many using the version 3 dataset at that time. As we discussed briefly before, EMS documentation is important for numerous reasons. The first is that EMS documentation, the patient care record, serves as part of the patient's medical record, which can be vital within the continuity of care. The nature of the scene, your assessment findings, treatments provided, and how the patient reacted to those treatments are all vital pieces of information that may be used by other healthcare professionals within the hospital environment to further define the care provided. Even if the PCR is not reviewed immediately in the emergency department, it may prove important to specialists once the patient is transferred to another area of the hospital. EMS providers are in the unique position to see the patient as he or she presents on the scene, and that information can be critical for physicians, nurses, and other healthcare providers at a definitive treatment facility. Proper documentation is critical for this purpose. Another important function of EMS documentation is administrative in nature, especially as it relates to billing. While not all EMS agencies may bill for services, the vast majority do, and having proper documentation is critical to being paid, especially when billing Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance companies. The data elements required for such billing extend well beyond demographic and insurance data to actually include information related to the patient's condition and the medical necessity of the transport. Mileage, equipment used, treatments performed, medications administered, and other related information is often required so that the patient or another responsible party can be properly billed for the EMS services provided by your agency. Additional data points may also prove important from an administrative standpoint for numerous reasons. The aggregate data from EMS reports may be used to impact staffing given call volume trends, determine the best location for a new station given response destination data, or present additional budget requests of municipal leaders based upon increasing requests for services. The information within EMS reports is also critical for incident review and quality assurance purposes. Paramedics function as an extension of a medical director when providing services out in the field, and the best way for an agency's medical director to ensure quality care is provided is to review the agency's patient care reports. If the patient suffers a less than optimal outcome, the PCR is a great starting point to evaluate the run and see what improvements could be made or if any medical errors occurred. On the flip side, positive patient outcomes can still be evaluated as part of ongoing quality assurance activities, and PCRs are vital to these ongoing and often mandated tasks. As discussed in another module, research is also a function of EMS. We must use data and evidence to drive patient care practices and decisions. The collection of this data and evidence begins with the patient care report. Lastly, while no one wants to document for this particular reason, it is nevertheless important to ensure patient interactions are documented completely in the event of a civil lawsuit sometime down the road. Such a lawsuit may not even involve the EMS agency directly. Rather, there may be a lawsuit between two independent parties given an event where EMS had to be called, such as a car accident or a slip and fall at a local grocery store. Having proper and complete documentation may make a significant difference in helping a wronged person seek reimbursement for damages or in protecting both yourself and your agency from liability for medical malpractice. As far as EMS documentation is concerned, there are some special considerations that should probably go without saying, but we will mention anyway. First, any document or electronic medium that contains an individual patient's protected health information must be treated as confidential. Even if the information is on a non-official piece of paper, such as notes or a drop sheet or half sheet that is handed off to ED staff, the information must be protected. This means that it should not be left sitting out in a report writing room when you take another call, or if completing an electronic PCR, that the screen is locked and non-viewable if the workstation is unattended, or the information is saved and the report is fully closed. Additionally, any notes or other non-official documents that are to be discarded must be securely destroyed. Just throwing them in the trash is not adequate. It is hard to talk about confidentiality in patient documentation without also discussing the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. Not only does HIPAA contain what is known as the Privacy Rule, which establishes national standards for the protection of individually identifiable health information, but it also has a Security Rule, which sets national standards for protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information. When you add this up, it means that your network connections for your ePCR software must be secure, which may mean using virtual private networks if you do not control the wireless network on which the data is being transferred. Patient data must be securely stored and adequately encrypted, and any business associates who have access to the electronic records must abide by HIPAA provisions as well. The term minimum necessary is often used within HIPAA discussions, which refers to the practice that only the personnel necessary for the specific business purpose have access to the data in question. With this being said, remember as well that EMS documentation may serve some other important functions that we have not discussed here, one of which may incorporate the public interest, such as mandatory reporting laws or open records laws. HIPAA allows disclosures of protected health information as required by law. If your agency is a governmental entity covered by an open records law, some portions of a PCR may indeed be subject to the provisions of that law. If your state has a law that requires mandatory reporting of certain injuries or suspected abuse or neglect, your EMS documentation may play a crucial role in that reporting. This also takes us to the last special consideration associated with the importance of EMS documentation, the distribution of that documentation. Needless to say, patient care reports must be delivered to the receiving hospital to serve the continuity of care function. It may be necessary to forward PCRs to billing agencies. Law enforcement activities and the court system may require access to records, either with or without a subpoena, depending upon the circumstances and laws in the jurisdiction, and a patient may ask for a copy of his or her PCR. Any distribution of EMS documentation must be controlled, tracked, and secure. Additionally, some of these distributions may be governed by laws that stipulate such distributions occur in a specific format or within a particular time frame. As an example, Wisconsin DHS 110.34 sub 7 requires EMS PCRs to be uploaded into the Wisconsin Ambulance Run data system within 7 days of the patient transport. Prior to that deadline, the hospital to which the patient was transported must receive a written report immediately upon transfer of the patient and a complete PCR within 24 hours of patient delivery. As far as the documentation itself is concerned, paper used to be the way in which everything was documented years ago. Now, however, agencies have transitioned to electronic reporting databases and software solutions that, in many instances, allow them to enter patient information directly into a tablet or mobile device while at the patient's side, regardless of where that patient is located. This transition has reduced the physical space required for storing patient care reports while also providing other benefits, such as automated aggregated reporting, query functionality, data mining, error correction features, report validation features, electronic signatures, electronic record transfers, and even the incorporation of digital multimedia data or attachments. Given the importance of EMS documentation, it should come as no surprise that poor documentation is problematic and could even result in negative consequences for the EMS provider or agency. With our previous discussion points in mind, poor documentation could very well lead to errors in providing patient care if someone were to rely upon an error-ridden or incomplete EMS PCR. If that same PCR is produced in court during a lawsuit, there could be an unjust result for the plaintiff or defendant, depending upon the circumstances, or the EMS agency or its providers may bear legal responsibility for plaintiff damages because the report failed to correctly document assessment findings, treatments provided, medications delivered, or other critical information. Even the quality of the spelling, punctuation, and grammar of the report can have implications for the provider or EMS agency years later in a lawsuit. The implication will be that poor documentation is reflective of the paramedic's overall poor work ethic, lack of attention to detail, and substandard quality. Part of producing a quality report is recognizing that documentation errors may happen and also knowing how to properly correct such an error. If you make an error while producing the documentation, how you handle the correction depends upon what type of report is being generated. If the report is being produced in an electronic format, simply make the correction as it is discovered. If the report is handwritten, then the process is a little different. You should place a single horizontal line through the error and initial and date the line. Then write the correct information next to the correction. Do not use an eraser, whiteout, correction tape, or scribbling to hide or remove the error. Once a report is finalized and submitted, corrections become a little more complicated as the original report should not be altered. Rather, an addendum should be filed, either electronically or as a paper edition, depending upon the PCR system in use at the EMS agency. Some electronic PCR systems do allow for modification of records by keeping track of changes to the record, such as the original text that has been subsequently deleted or changed, what was added, if anything, who made the changes, deletions, or additions, and when the change, deletion, or addition was done. While not necessarily related to an error, some systems allow for or require supplemental narratives or information to be added after the completion of the report. One such example may be when a crew creates a skeleton report to hand off to the receiving hospital, which is then updated later when the crew has more time. In such cases, it is important to know exactly what information was provided to the hospital initially, as well as the follow-up information that was added later, in addition to who added it and when. One common error that has a huge impact on data collection, reports, and research is the omission of information or the use of NA, not applicable, unknown, or other when there is indeed a valid data element that should be entered in that category. This type of error has been known to occur in electronic systems in particular where validation of data is required. Rather than scrolling through all the available choices, many providers may simply elect to take the proverbial path of least resistance and select one of these options as opposed to actually finding the appropriate response. Have you heard of the expression garbage in, garbage out? The value of statewide reporting systems and Nemesis is undermined significantly when incorrect or inappropriate data is included within a patient care report, especially when other more valid choices should have been included in the report. Such practices have a negative impact on the quality of the system and can undermine the value of the electronic reporting to begin with. Electronic PCR data is awesome for compiling data and results to drive system improvement and quality efforts. If the data is incorrect, inadequate, or inappropriate, however, that value is lost. Again, failures to correct errors in EMS documentation can be problematic for the patient, the EMS provider, and the EMS agency. Things are elevated a bit in the case of willful falsification of a patient care report. Maybe the crew is trying to hide a mistake or a breach in protocol, such as a provider who makes up a second set of vitals, fudges the times on the report to make the response or treatments provided to appear more timely, or omits the documentation on a missed IV attempt or other failed skill. Or the provider is simply being lazy and just wants to complete the report as quickly as possible, and making up data is the quickest way to that end. Regardless, intentionally including bad or wrong information or consciously omitting pertinent or required information can give rise to discipline up to termination, potential civil liability, or even criminal charges, such as in cases where falsification of government documents or fraud may be alleged, especially if the erroneous documentation is being submitted to a third-party payer, such as Medicare or an insurance company. This conversation about poor documentation could also include a discussion about a poor documentation process. If a provider or agency loses a PCR or some other document that contains protected patient health information, that is a problem. This could also include poor network or electronic storage security, as a data breach compromises patient confidentiality and their reasonable expectations that their electronic data will be secure. If such a release of protected health information occurs, HIPAA mandates agencies to follow specific notification steps for those who are impacted, and breaches of HIPAA can also result in fines. While proper EMS documentation is important in all cases, there are some runs in particular where the documentation becomes even more critical given potential legal or quality implications. Probably the most high profile of these runs are those that involve patient refusals. Patient refusals are very interesting because there is a strong legal component to them. There is a separate module on the legal aspects of patient consent and refusal of care, so we will not dive too deeply into the topic in this presentation. For the purposes of this discussion, however, it is important to recognize that there is a difference between the words capacity and competence. Sometimes EMS providers and even educators use the words interchangeably, but there is a significant difference between the two. As defined by the Cornell Law School Legal Information Institute, being competent means having the ability to understand and execute a legal document, to be sufficiently mentally able to stand trial or testify in a criminal case, to be able to act in the circumstances, or to reason or make decisions. Capacity, on the other hand, refers to the ability to make a rational decision based upon all relevant facts and considerations. While these two terms may sound similar, establishing competence often requires a determination to be made by a physician or a mental health professional within a formal legal setting, such as a court. Competence is often a determination made by a court. In contrast, establishing capacity does not typically require such a high level of specialized knowledge. Stated another way, competency is the degree of mental soundness necessary to make decisions about a specific issue or to carry out a specific act. Capacity is a person's ability to simply make an informed decision. Therefore, when determining whether or not someone has the legal ability to make decisions for him or herself within the context of emergency medical care, we refer to that person as either having or lacking capacity. So how does an EMS provider establish patient capacity? To begin, the law typically presumes that people have capacity to make decisions for themselves, especially where personal healthcare decisions are concerned. The rules change somewhat when minors are involved, along with individuals with specific cognitive disabilities. It is also possible to lose capacity based upon specific circumstances, such as a person with a head injury or someone under the effects of alcohol or drugs. Unfortunately, each situation is different, and the circumstances presented on an individual run could tip the proverbial scales one way or the other. EMS agencies should have protocols in place to assist paramedics with determining when a patient lacks capacity to make healthcare decisions for him or herself. Regardless of what determination is made, it is important to document those underlying findings objectively and completely. As we are talking about patient refusals here, that means documenting why the EMS crew believed the person had capacity or why there was no reason to believe the person did not have capacity to refuse treatment or transport. Even if transport is not provided because the patient refused, the EMS crew must document all aspects of the assessment conducted and any care provided or treatments and medications administered. If the EMS crew believes the patient would benefit by receiving specific treatment or by being transported, yet the patient refuses, so long as the patient has capacity for that refusal, the EMS crew typically must defer to that patient's decision. Again, there is more on this topic in the legal module dealing with consent and refusal of care. A patient refusing treatment or transport against the advice of the EMS crew also requires some additional care when documenting. The EMS crew should be sure to document the information they provided to the patient when he or she made the decision, along with any warnings they provided to the patient and the fact that the crew hopefully told him or her to call 911 again if the patient's condition worsens or the patient changes his or her mind about not receiving treatment or going to the hospital. While the odds of being called into court are typically not very high, the odds definitely seem to increase when a patient refusal is involved, especially if that patient eventually suffers harm because of the refusal. As a result, documenting those refusals completely and appropriately is very important. Another probable or likely scenario in EMS that impacts documentation is the occurrence of a mass or multiple casualty incident. In these incidents, the number of patients who require care overwhelms the initial responding units, and decisions must often be made quickly as to which patients receive what level of care given limited resources available on the scene. Within the initial stages of a mass casualty incident, triage tags are commonly used and constitute the first attempt to document patient assessment and treatment. Anyone who is transported should have a patient care report completed by the EMS crew just like any other patient they transport, regardless of whether it is a multiple casualty incident or not. Emerging research also shows that some people who are initially triaged by EMS will simply leave the scene and arrange for their own transport to a local hospital if they are capable to do so. Unfortunately, capturing information from these people can be problematic, and it is probably not feasible to generate a patient care report for them. An additional challenge with multiple casualty incidents is that of patient tracking. In larger incidents, patients may be transported to different hospitals by different EMS agencies, and there is no one centralized way to track which patients are going where. This makes things difficult for incident commanders and public information officers who receive information requests from members of the public looking for friends or family members who were involved in the incident. Some agencies have implemented barcode tracking systems into their multiple casualty incident planning, but these systems are far from widely adopted. Ultimately, each EMS agency should develop their own policies and procedures on how to handle not only the multiple casualty incident itself, but the documentation that goes along with such an incident, along with the means to track patients through the system. In addition to a traditional patient care report, there are some other instances or scenarios in which an EMS provider may need to complete additional or different reports. One such occasion is when mutual aid, an ALS intercept, or some type of interagency cooperation is used, which could include the use of a helicopter or other aeromedical service. If you are handing off a patient to another agency for treatment and transport, you may or may not be required to complete a full patient care report depending upon your local protocols or state regulations. Even if you are not required to complete a patient care report given that another agency will be transporting the patient, it is still in your best interest to document the call thoroughly, including what you encountered upon arrival, how the patient presented, what treatments or interventions you performed, how the patient reacted to those treatments or interventions, any vitals obtained, special circumstances that arose, and so on. There is no guarantee that the intercept, mutual aid, or transporting unit will document your involvement appropriately, and if there is ever a question as to what you saw or did, the last thing you want to do is rely on incorrect or incomplete documentation from another provider or agency. Another special type of run is one that involves mandatory reporting under your state's laws. When we say legal reporting on this slide, we are referring to instances where an EMS provider is required by law to report something to law enforcement or other appropriate authorities. Such cases routinely involve child abuse or neglect, elder abuse or neglect, and certain injuries such as stab or gunshot wounds. Depending upon your local protocols or governing laws, such mandatory reporting may require the completion of a form or other documentation separate from the traditional EMS patient care report. While EMS providers should practice standard precautions and take steps to minimize the risk of exposure to bloodborne pathogens and other disease transmission, providing emergency medical care in the field can be wrought with unforeseen circumstances and risks that are difficult to anticipate or effectively mitigate. If you ever suffer a significant exposure to blood or other bodily fluids, it is not unusual for healthcare and EMS agencies to require the completion of additional documentation related to the event and exposure. The term exposures, as used here, could also include other things beyond bloodborne pathogens, such as toxic chemicals or drugs. As an example, there are increasing occurrences across the country, given the opioid epidemic, of emergency workers suffering inadvertent narcotic overdoses by being exposed to carfentanil. In a somewhat related vein, if an EMS provider suffers an injury, most employers have specific forms or other documents that must be completed to document that injury for workers' compensation, OSHA, state safety and health, or other purposes. Such paperwork may be required even if the EMS provider does not need medical treatment. Additionally, many progressive EMS agencies also have a near-miss reporting process that allows employees to document instances where someone could have been hurt, if not for some simple stroke of luck or fortuitous timing. Given that this presentation is geared toward paramedic students, it is also important to recognize that many paramedics provide interfacility transportation services. In Wisconsin, those interfacility transports are provided by critical care paramedics. A patient care report for an interfacility transport is typically a little different than one used on a 911 response. In these cases, it is important to document the status of the patient while he or she was picked up at the transferring hospital. Include any information that was provided by the healthcare providers at the site, along with any documentation they provided. Not only should you document the reason for the transfer, but ask about any complications the patient had suffered up to this point, perform your own assessment of the patient and document your findings, and be sure to also make note of any anomalies or unusual circumstances. As an example, if an IV infiltrated prior to the patient being transferred to your care, be sure to document that. The last thing you want is for someone downstream, so to speak, to try and claim you were responsible for harm to a patient when the problem occurred prior to your receipt of the patient. While you will document the transport itself similar to that as any other call, the transfer of the patient to the receiving hospital warrants particular attention for the same reason. If a medical error occurs during or after patient transfer, you want to have documentation that adequately supports that in the event your care is called into question. We are also beginning to see EMS agencies across the country providing primary care medical services in patients' homes under the guise of programs called Mobile Integrated Healthcare, Community EMS, or Community Paramedicine. These are services provided by EMS agencies where the patient is not transported to an emergency department. Rather, the patient may be taken to a specialty care facility, a physician's office, or maybe the patient is not transported anywhere. He or she is evaluated and treated by EMS providers on the scene without any intention of the patient going anywhere. In systems where these services are provided, a typical 911 patient care report is probably not utilized or adequate to document this type of interaction, and a different form or document is used. Depending upon your local protocols, policies, and procedures, your EMS agency may have additional documentation requirements for EMS providers given different duties, scenarios, or circumstances. As always, you will need to be familiar with the documentation requirements in place at your particular EMS agency and be sure you are following policies, procedures, and protocols that apply. The proper completion of a typical patient care report follows many of the same guidelines that you learned as an EMT. Just because you are studying to be a paramedic does not mean these basics have changed. Rather, the same elements apply. As a paramedic, the information you include will simply have more depth and detail. Electronic systems are great for helping to ensure all data is included within a report, as the fields provided in the electronic record serve as prompts for the provider that specific information is required. Beyond that, however, even without the prompts, there are several things you want to be sure to include in all patient care reports. First, be sure to ascertain any treatment the patient may have received prior to your arrival and document that. Also include information related to the patient's initial presentation and, if pertinent, the condition of the scene. If you experienced response delays, that should also be documented. Once patient contact is established, you will begin your assessment of the patient. Be sure to document the details of that assessment and your findings. Be thorough, descriptive, and objective. If the patient, a bystander, a friend, a family member, or someone else on the scene provides you with pertinent information, include that information within your documentation and denote the source of that information. If you make an observation that is related to the patient, his or her condition, or the care you are providing, include that information in the documentation and denote the source of that observation. As an example, pretend for a moment that you were dispatched to a grocery store for a patient who suffered a fall. The crux of the incident is that the patient slipped on a wet floor and suffered an injury. If the patient stated that she slipped on a wet floor, be sure to document that statement and attribute it to the patient by denoting patient stated she slipped on the wet floor within your report. If a bystander says something related to the patient's condition, like she fell backward and hit her head, be sure to include in the report something along the lines of a bystander stated the patient fell backward and hit her head. If you arrived and noticed that the area by the patient was covered in water or was slippery, it may be prudent to include in the report that the patient was found on the floor adjacent to a puddle of water. All of this information not only paints a picture of the injury the patient may have suffered, but it is also creating a document that will prove very useful if this slip and fall ever results in litigation. Next, be sure to include your clinical impression, otherwise known as your working diagnosis. In developing a clinical impression, what you find as a part of your patient assessment is only one of the pieces that must be documented. Also be sure to include what are known as pertinent negatives. These are assessment findings that are used to rule out particular diagnoses. Given the example above, documenting something like patient denied hitting her head, stated she did not lose consciousness and currently has no pain in her neck or head, is obviously an important piece of information for anyone who needs to determine the potential injuries a patient may have suffered in the fall. Documenting both pertinent positives as well as negatives is important in helping you document the reasons for whatever clinical impression you develop, which subsequently drives the care you will then provide for the patient. In addition to fully documenting your assessment findings, also be sure to document all treatments provided, interventions performed, and medications that were delivered. If an intervention attempt is unsuccessful, that attempt must still be documented. Be sure to include times for all milestones, which would include obtaining vitals, intervention attempts, and medication deliveries. Adequate details must be provided for each treatment, intervention, or medication delivery as well. This means denoting what was done, who did it, which crew member, what time it was performed, whether the attempt was successful, and, in the case of medication delivery, the name of the medication administered along with the dose, rate, and route of administration. If any interventions are performed upon the direction of medical control, document the order, the physician's name, and who received the order. How the patient responded to any interventions should also be documented, which leads into reassessments. Unless the transport time is very short, it will be necessary to reassess your patient. Such reassessments should be fully documented, just as though they were initial assessments. If you experience any delays in transport, like being stopped by a train, include that delay within your documentation and, if possible, include the times related to that delay. While speaking about times, it is also important that your times correlate throughout the call. This means that your times are synchronized or consistent with dispatch times. Having an intervention time that occurs prior to the time dispatch reflects you arrived on scene, for example, is problematic. Some electronic devices like automated blood pressure machines, EKG and 12-lead machines, and computers or tablet devices used for reporting typically have their own internal clocks. It is important to routinely check those devices to ensure their internal clocks are correct to avoid consistency issues in documentation if the clocks in those separate devices are not correct or synchronized. Lastly, document the patient's condition upon arrival at the destination facility. Errors or problems have been known to occur during patient handoff and movement at destination facilities. Adequately documenting the patient's condition upon arrival at the destination facility, along with any problems that may have occurred during the transfer, could prove to be very important if an allegation of malpractice or negligent care occurs later. One example is documenting the depth of an endotracheal tube at the time of patient transfer. If the tube becomes dislodged during patient movement to the hospital gurney or later, having the tube depth documented at the time of transfer can be critical to effectively defending against a medical malpractice or negligence lawsuit. While both paper as well as electronic EMS patient care reports include specific data fields that must be completed, there is also space provided for a narrative. This narrative space is a great area for including information that does not fit neatly into one of those previously mentioned data fields. Essentially, your narrative should paint a picture of the patient's presentation, assessment findings, what was done by the EMS crew to help the patient, and how the patient ultimately fared while in the care of the EMS crew. As far as narratives are concerned, there are several schools of thought as to how a narrative should be formatted. The first is to simply document events as they occurred in chronological order. The format is very linear and leads the reader through the call as it occurred from beginning to end. Another method of generating a narrative is to use the SOAP method. Rather than describing the call from beginning to end, you use headers for sections that contain information related to the patient's subjective impressions, your objective observations, the results of your assessment, your working diagnosis, and the treatment plan, the interventions performed. A third method for narrative generation is to use what is known as the chart with an E at the end method. Similar to the SOAP method, you use sections with headings to include information within the narrative. These headings and the subsequent information contained underneath them include the patient's chief complaint, the history of the present illness, your assessment findings including any signs and symptoms, treatments provided, transport information including the patient's status when transferred to the hospital staff, and any exceptions or special circumstances that need to be included. One last method for developing a narrative is to do so by body system or body parts. In this type of narrative, the provider essentially documents through a head-to-toe assessment while being sure to include other pertinent information from the scene and patient presentation, in addition to interventions performed and other information. In comparison to the other three methods described, this one is probably the least popular within an EMS environment as it can be time-consuming, especially when a thorough head-to-toe assessment is not warranted, and it can be difficult to remember other components to include in the narrative if they do not correlate directly to a specific body part or system. Whatever style you decide to employ when writing your patient care report narratives may be defined by your agency's protocol or it may simply be a matter of personal preference. If you have the latitude to determine how to develop your narrative, it is recommended that you pick a style and stick with it so that developing your narratives becomes simpler over time given your routine use of consistent elements within your narratives. Switching back and forth between styles, especially within a single patient care report, can be problematic and result in you forgetting or overlooking important narrative elements that you would typically include. When writing your narrative, it is recommended that you avoid abbreviations and acronyms unless they are defined and supported by your local protocols. Also remember that you may find yourself being judged in court not based upon the care you provided, but how well you documented that care. This means that spelling, punctuation, and grammatical errors can be used by an opposing attorney to attempt to show a lack of care, due diligence, and competence on your part. Ensuring your narratives are adequately detailed and well organized while utilizing proper grammar, spelling, and punctuation is important. Remember that you are an EMS professional and your patient care report is a direct reflection on you. Along similar lines, even if you are not the one drafting the report, if you were part of the transporting crew, you will want to review the report before it is finalized to ensure all details are complete and the report is error-free. If called into court years later, it does not matter who drafted the report, as it will be associated with any provider whose name is on it. While it is true that completing documentation may be a less than glamorous aspect of the job, it is still a necessary and important duty associated with the profession. Poor documentation can hurt the patient, your agency, and even you as a provider. Take pride in generating your reports. Someday, you may be glad that you did. That takes us to the end of the module. You should now be able to identify minimum data to be included on a patient care report. Identify the general principles regarding the importance of EMS documentation and the ways in which such documents are used. Describe the potential consequences of illegible, incomplete, or inaccurate documentation. Describe the special documentation considerations concerning patient refusal of care or transport, and describe the special considerations concerning mass casualty incidents or other unique reports. This presentation was prepared by Waukesha County Technical College in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, and is distributed with an Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International Creative Commons license. Copyright 2019 Waukesha County Technical College. For information on WCTC's numerous fire and EMS educational offerings, please visit us online at wctc.edu.